excited to be here with you, Pooja. So this is Pooja Brown, VP of Platform Engineering at Stitch Fix. We were just having a little bit of banter before this about our kind of experiences and adjusting to this crazy world and the stages of grief, you know, that many of us have gone through, and many of us have gotten to kind of that acceptance place because it's been a little while now being in lockdown for many of us. All that said, I'd actually love to start high level, Pooja, just to learn a little bit about you, to, you know, anything that you want to share with your, you know, background and anything kind of relevant to this crazy pandemic that's going on and how it's affected Stitch Fix, how it's affected you personally, and maybe, you know, how you're doing your day by day, acknowledging that we have engineering managers, aspiring engineering managers and leaders, directors, et cetera. You know, I think actually everybody's curious to know kind of how are you faring? What are you doing? How have you, you know, kind of anything that you want to share to start. And then if folks feel free, as you have questions, put them in the Q&A, not in the main chat, but in the Q&A at the bottom, and then upvote them. Right now we only have 3 in. I'd love to see more. So any questions that you have, they don't have to specifically be exactly on this particular topic if you think that it would be really helpful to learn something as it relates to engineering management from Pooja. So feel free to chime in, upvote, and with that, Pooja, yeah, feel free to share. Tell us about yourself and your experiences thus far.
It's quite the lead up. Well, and Mustafa. Hi, everyone. I'm Pooja Brown. I'm VP Platform Engineering for Stitch Fix. You know, I've been managing remote and distributed teams for a very large part of my career. So I really appreciate this sort of opportunity to talk about this. You know, how do you keep your teams connected, motivated, sort of performing, norming, moving forward as they sort of learn to coexist with COVID in this new reality. Right? But before I get started there, like, you know, there's a practice at Stitch Fix that I really like, which is this notion of clearing. Like, a lot of big meetings start with a clearing, and a clearing is just a way to get something off your chest, right? And it brings a humanizing element to anything that's sort of large and scary. You know, this is it's not scary, but we're a lot of people in a meeting. And so I want to share a clearing with all of you and just sort of like, oh my God, like this is such a new experience for everybody. And just sort of like giving yourself a minute to realize that, like, get some perspective as you think through how do you create the perfect organization and the functional teams as you work through these situations, etc. First and foremost, these are unprecedented, uncharted times. None of us have seen this before in our lives, right? So cut yourself some slack. That would be my first advice. Cut yourself some slack. Your health, your family's health, and their safety is number one. So keep reminding yourself that. Now, the second part sort of into this is, to some extent, we are amongst the fortunate people, right? We know how to do our jobs with a laptop and a Wi-Fi connection. And most likely, we can be at least 95 to 100% functional with that. So just sort of like anytime I'm sort of like, like, I don't know what I'm dealing with, just realize that we are really the fortunate lot. And to some extent, we've kind of been prepping for this day. Like, I'm sure even outside this pandemic, almost everybody here has had a work from home day or had an employee who worked from home and still was productive, right? So if you think about the fact that of the entire human workforce, we are a chosen lot that actually was prepared for it, that to me is a very settling experience. That, okay, it is not really so unfamiliar territory. We know how to do this. There's a saying that our CEO, Katrina Lake, says, is like, every company is a tech company, right? Irrespective of what industry you're in, you are already, or you should have been, outside this pandemic, investing in ways of how you overcome physical distances, right? And that just means you're going to rely on technology for it. There's just no other question around it, right? Just my clearing is keep things in perspective. these are unprecedented times. Give yourself some slack. I'm a mom of 2 kids, a 6-year-old and an 18-month-old. My husband works full time. Holy shit. Like just being able to manage all of that with kids and homeschooling and still be a good parent and keep your jobs, it's a lot. So as much as I really appreciate so many folks wanting to care about their teams and making sure that, you know, we're still functioning at this time, it is more important for you to be centered and grounded and healthy and mentally there. And whatever that is, whatever that takes for you, do that. If that's a run, if that's meditation, if that's Pilates in the morning, if that's 30 minutes of not doing anything, do that, because your teams need you centered and grounded. And then we can think about the rest of your teams. So I just wanted to share that, start there. I look forward to the discussion today, and I want to be able to share my experiences and understand what's on your mind and what are things that are challenging. I also want to caveat is my experiences have been around distributed and remote teams. They might not work when everybody is distributed. So these are new times, and just acknowledge that. So I'll stop there. But I just
that's awesome. I actually felt myself getting emotional as you were sharing that. It was and I mean the reality is we're in an emotional time, right? It's kind of unpredictable what some things that come up for us. I take away from that the importance and the value of self-care, which I really appreciate. Just thinking about the other AMA sessions that we've had talking, you know, I think folks have kind of very quickly dove into, all right, you have this new world of everybody's distributed, here's how you figure it out. But 100% like place your own mask on before placing it on your child. You know, it's like, take care of yourself so that you have the capacity to be able to take care of others and take care of your team. And the other thing I appreciated from what you shared is being gentle with yourself was kind of the, you know, the sentiment that I got, right? That because these are unprecedented times, we don't need to be as perfect and on top of everything as we might expect of ourselves. It's okay to do things that we wouldn't normally do. As a side thing, you know, I teach spin, and like while I've been in quarantine for the last month and some, I haven't exercised at all. And I have a lot of like personal shame and guilt about that, just as somebody for whom this is a big part of my life. And like, what I realized is like, I need to be gentle on myself, not beat myself up. We're going to form unusual habits in quarantine that are not going to stay with us when we get out of quarantine. Right. And it's okay for us just to, you know, assuming that we're not doing like permanent harm, like it's okay to do things that are a little bit atypical that may not always feel great, you know, as whether it be coping mechanisms or whatever, because that's kind of where we are right now.
We are, exactly. Like cut yourself some slack, but don't get me wrong. There are days when I tell my team is I want to eat my weight in chips. like that's how I feel today. And that doesn't mean I'm going to do this when I'm sort of in the normal workforce, but this is how I'm coping with it. So I like your sort of like, be gentle, cut yourself some slack, and trust me, nobody has the right tooling and right answers right now.
Totally. So with that in mind, I love that as a way to start. I'd love to dive into some of the questions that folks have asked. So this first one here from Brent: how do you measure the success of your development teams? How do you measure the success of an individual developer, acknowledging, you know, that you're not in the same room with them?
You know, I'll be honest, is like Stitch Fix has actually been really good about how do you make remote work effective, right? So if you sort of take yourself out of the context of the pandemic, right, and you think about like how do you assess productivity of teams, right? In this time and age right now, it is really important for us to be strategic around how we hire. And hiring means we should be able to find talent wherever it exists. So if you assume that, right, that means you really have to think differently about how do you assess remote work, right? How do you make sure that the teams are communicating enough, right? And I think, you know, when I think about how do you assess productivity of teams, right, it's no different than how do you assess productivity of on-site teams. right? And that's where, when you look at, I'll give you an example. Like we use OKRs, right? OKRs is a really simple way for teams to sign up for objectives, right? And have key results that say, yes, we met that objective, and this is how we're going to measure it by. In my mind, this is no different, right, than whether it was an on-site or a remote team, right? If you really look at, are the teams hitting their objectives? Are there ways to measure that? That's how you assess a team's productivity, right? There's this sort of like old school way of like, if the person is sitting right next to you, or if you're co-located with your team, you can actually determine if somebody showed up to work today and if they're working hard. I think we're way beyond those times, right? So I feel like, having a process on some sort of normal cadence to assess a team's productivity is important, right? Investing in things like whether these are, your sprint processes or OKRs or whatever makes sense, but you need some sort of cadence to be able to come together and say, yes, we as a team delivered against that. Right? From an individual productivity perspective, right, I feel like there's, again, like I want to say, like remote versus distributed versus on-site. Like I think if you look at submitting code, right, if today in day and age you don't use a GitHub or GitHub style sort of commit code versioning software, I think there's a problem, right? And like there's a lot of things that you can assess through how developers are interacting with changes, how large projects are taken and broken into small chunks, into small viable changes, and the context that people are providing around why you're making a change, right? Think of all the arguments that you see on a pull request, right, today. And it usually is not enough context being provided around a change, right? And that's a really strong signal around your developers' productivity, your developers' ability to take in a large thing and break it up into smaller changes that can be made. So I look at it as that, I don't see this as any different of remote versus online versus on-site. I look at it as like, what are the practices that you've established for your team's productivity and for your individual productivity in terms of quarterly goals or weekly goals and individual goals around code submission. And if those practices are not online, or there are no ways to bring them in a digitized manner, you're going to have a problem assessing productivity.
Totally makes sense. I think the high level takeaway I get is actually, it's really interesting. Nobody's mentioned this so far, but it's totally true. By the way, whatever chimes that you have, maybe if you can.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
It's all good. No worries. But no, the reflection that I have is goals and goal setting is universal regardless of whether you're remote or not. And how you determine whether someone is successful or not in your organization, the ability to determine that and the criteria that you use to determine that doesn't magically change when everybody goes remote. It may be that your methodology to identify those things changes, but the actual criteria doesn't change. And what you're kind of talking about is having very, very clear goals and then measuring those goals with your team with whatever tools are available is kind of the most core thing. And you're mentioning OKRs is a great methodology to do that, both on a quarterly basis and then on like how are people tracking towards their piece of the OKR that they're working on. And in addition, if you're using whether it be GitHub or some kind of internal tool to track, code edits and changes and pull requests and feedback, that's a place to monitor like what's actually going on with what people are doing code-wise. And what's interesting is it implies, actually I'm curious about this, like for Stitch Fix, like do you all use like a peer review system, or like how, when people are giving and receiving feedback on code, like how do you evaluate from that, like whether someone's doing something right or doing something wrong? And is there a code review system you use to kind of ensure that, or what processes do you use?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, like, we're 70% distributed from a tech organization perspective at Stitch Fix. So we made a lot of investments upfront of how you make remote work effective, right? And that's sort of like, we're on GitHub, right? There's guidelines around how we submit a pull request, what are the context that is provided, conversations. We have processes like Forward the Foundation, which is how we record architectural decisions. Some things, if you see a pull request and if you see a lot of people disagreeing, you realize that sometimes it is actually an architecture decision that is being made within the context of that pull request, right? So we extract that into what we call is a architectural decision review process, right? Where we take those meta conversations and actually document responsibly why we're bringing this change, how it's impacting the systems, why we think it will enable additional things in the future, right? So I feel like we did a ton of work upfront to make sure that remote work actually is effective, right? And some of it is relying on, using GitHub, having a clear process of how architectural decisions are documented, recorded, discussed, right? Having some guidelines around how to provide context around your changes, right? Sort of like a lot of the conversations are just people just don't know why you're doing things. Right? And then we also did a ton of work to actually break up our monolithic applications into much smaller micro apps or microservices, right? Where the people making changes have already a lot of the context, right? The other part of it is like when you're dealing with, millions of lines of code and you're trying to understand the impact of a small piece of change, you're just not going to be able to. So we made a lot of technology investments up front to actually break it up. So people who are closest to the stakeholders, as well as to the system that they're making changes in, have enough context to give you feedback. Right. So to your question, like, I feel like these are things that whether like to build a healthy technology organization and a healthy system, you need to invest in. I don't see them as any different from having developers sitting right next to you versus virtually.
Right. I imagine though that like when somebody's sitting next to you, it's easier to obviously, whether it be see over their shoulder or hear like conversations that are happening organically, that there probably needs to be a way to know what's going on over there. Do you do like regular, whether it be one-on-ones, or I'm curious actually, like, how do you check in with folks, particularly now, in this new world?
There's a saying that I really like which is trust has like a shelf life of 6 weeks.
Interesting.
And you need to keep replenishing and investing in it to continue the trust relationship, right? And it's just sort of like, if you take that and if you blow that concept across, a very distributed remote team, means you need to keep investing in building trust between two parties. And trust comes from communication, trust comes from understanding the context, trust from knowing where your head's at when you're bringing in, when you're making a change to the system, when you're thinking about something. So I just sort of like, if you look at that, I feel where my job today is actually a lot of, touch bases across my teams, right? And some of these are micro, some of these are macro. Right? But that's what our job starts looking like, right? Is that when I say micro is sort of like, okay, one-on-ones, having conversations, having structured conversations around potentially a topic, but also having just sort of water cooler conversations in these one-on-ones. And I will say one thing is that why this is super important is when you're, this is the change that I'm realizing myself, is that the advantage of having some people next to you, there would be a lot of hallway conversations, right? And how do you simulate this in that world? And there's a lot of importance in those hallway conversations. You get to build trust, you get to know what's in somebody's mind, right? So I feel like those micro conversations are really important, right? And I think like from a macro perspective, I feel that even though I say, I've been managing distributed and remote teams forever, in the last 5 weeks of this shelter in place and pandemic, I feel I've become a more empathetic leader because now I'm actually facing the constraints of being remote, right? I've always been in a somewhat of a privileged position where my teams might be remote, but I was always placed in HQ. Mm-hmm. Right? So you realize that there is a gap of communication, and your job as a leader is to continue to broadcast and share that or bridge that gap. So I'll give examples. It's like sort of like besides these touch bases, right, is sort of we have Slack channels where I continue to share information, right? Whether it's notes from exec meetings, whether it's things on my mind, things I've heard, I call them mythbusters. It's sort of like, okay, these are things I'm hearing. This is my take on it. Having study halls with my directs, right? Which is like basically we're study hall / co-working spaces, which I really like is I'm logged in here, come in, ask questions or work with me while I work through it. So you're sharing some context. Those are other ways that you can kind of get macro without having just scheduled one-on-ones and TVs.
That's cool. It's because I know I'm familiar, obviously office hours, but at study halls, I like that concept because of course it reminds me of being younger, but the idea that it's like, this is a place where you can work together as opposed to office hours. It's often like, all right, tell me what your question is, but there's this more welcoming.
Co-working space, it's got low commitment. We've all, it's not new, but like we are doing virtual happy hours, right? And I feel like, there's always this concern for like this awkward silence, right? And it's just sort of like, that's okay, right? Like
right.
So they're like we're in technology. I'm an introvert, even though I might not be coming across as like the way I recharge myself is a glass of wine and no communication with the human workforce.
I'm the same. Yeah.
I just like you need that, but sometimes, especially in these times, it's kind of been nice to log into a virtual happy hour and just hang.
Totally.
Know that, like we'll banter about how hard it is to get groceries or what's going on in your world. But even that is a way to create an environment that feels like you are remote, but still connected.
So the theme that I'm getting here is in general, like over communicating and a need, and this, I've heard this as well from some of the other folks who shared, like there's a real need to simulate the water cooler chat that you don't normally get, and that those conversations are important to have them in the one-on-ones, do virtual happy hours, do a lot of that interpersonal stuff, which makes total sense. I want to start getting through more of the questions just in the interest of time. This one's an interesting one because even though it's not 100% related to being remote, it got upvoted quite a bit. It's also interesting to me, actually, somebody who's been thinking about actually addressing this problem with my current startup. Can you explain your experience creating a career ladder in a startup for the first time and creating the levels frameworks for engineers? So I imagine a lot of people they have team members, maybe some of them they call senior, they don't really know how to structure careers and levels. And I'm sure that relates to compensation as well. Like, where do they start?
Start by not reinventing the wheel.
Like, look what's out there, right?
What's out there, right? It's just sort of like, that's the way, I've worked with multiple companies, right? Where they've tried to solve the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's no difference, right? It's just sort of like you have a career progression for ICs versus managers, right? Sort of like first off level set, and like those are two different tracks. And I feel like the technology landscape took a while to really understand that these are two different tracks, right? And that's where I feel, especially in startup environments, those get blurred really quickly. And then you end up unwinding from some of those decisions, right? People try from IC to manager because they think that they're doing really well, and the next promotion comes from a manager perspective. They realize they don't like managing people, and you also lost a really strong engineer as part of it. So just sort of like first is acceptance, is there are two different tracks, and lots of companies have done it before. So start with an example, a rubric that exists there. And that's usually my take on it, is start with a rubric and then work your way backwards, given the number of people that you have, given where you are as a business, given where you are from, and when you say comp, et cetera, like there's lots of nuances that are specific to the context that you're operating in, right? What is your remote versus distributed policy? How do you think about geographic locations? Then you start layering on top of it, right? But that I fundamentally think, though, in how, no matter what, if you're more than a size of 4 people, you need a rubric. And I say 4 tech people, because when they say toxic cultures or cultural issues, right, it usually stems with not having a fair way to distinguish people and their contributions. Mm-hmm. Right. So I really feel strongly that a rubric is important. People think you have to be the size of an organization to do it. I think
no, but you need to know what your job description is. You know what job you're doing, right?
Yeah. All trades is good, but very quickly you're going to want to know how to move forward.
Yep.
You need to have that conversation.
Totally. No, it makes sense. And it's interesting because, I mean, literally my co-founder and I have been living in this space for the last couple of weeks, and we're actually building a tool to be able to just provide these ladders. But as a tool for folks who may not know about this, what you mentioned, Pooja, about don't reinvent the wheel. So there's actually this great website that has a list of levels of a lot of different companies, particularly for software engineers, called levels.fyi. Levels.fyi. And if you go there, you can see both ladder structure information as well as compensation information related to some of the big tech companies, which doesn't mean you need to necessarily do what they're doing. And of course, startups cannot afford what larger tech companies pay, right? But having a structure, whether it's you have your associate level maybe, and then level 1, level 2, level 3, senior 1, senior 2. I mean, everybody has a different system, but actually most people have a very similar system. So check out that website. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the next thing. How do you manage your calendar so that you don't find yourself booked in back-to-back meetings all day, every day? This seems to be even more of a pattern when everyone's working remotely.
This was a discussion that my team brought up in one of our larger Slack channels, is that they're starting to feel the calendars being booked a lot more, right? Just because people having this need to stay connected, mm-hmm. right? And it's interesting, there's these, as you said, these stages of grief and acceptance, right? I felt the first couple of weeks of this pandemic, my calendar just exploded. And you sort of realize, going back to what are boundaries that you need to create, right, as an effective worker, that is important for, 1, people to know how you work, right, and then 2, just for self-care, right? And I feel that's been my learning through this. A lot of it is just sort of what does my day look like, right? I have kids at home. I prep lunch and breakfast and dinner while my husband does a lot of homeschooling activities. We balance things. And I feel you really have to block hours in your calendar and public, we use shared calendar, or not shared calendars. Our calendars are public inside the company, so people know what people are doing. And I've been putting bands in my calendar, take kids out for a walk, right? This is do not schedule time because I'm prepping lunch for my kids. And I feel starting with that mindset of blocking time on your calendar that is really not available is very important, right? And that's been helpful for me. And then just sort of I think people really recognize that already. The other things that I've seen is just giving a heads up to folks that maybe you won't have your video on, or, hey, I'd love to get some fresh air. Feel free to do the same. So we don't feel you and I have to be constrained to a video conversation. And even that, I feel my team has actually really appreciated that, right? Because it gives them the flexibility of not having a video on conversation, mm-hmm. right? And I feel there's this expectation that you need to be present and connecting and all of this during this, when everybody's working remote. And I'd like to give people that flexibility to manage that.
Totally. And it's interesting because I've heard before how important it is with communication, to have the video on because body language says so much. But at the same time, related back to how we started this conversation, talking about self-care and how important that is, that allowing people to have that space, that they don't have to be always on all the time, and that it's okay if they just want to chat and be messy and, you know, lie in bed while having the conversation if they need, you know, that's actually okay sometimes.
Yeah, and I would, you know, I'd say it's like my kids have been popping in and out of you know, Zoom calls with me when I'm at work, and I'll be honest, I felt so much, despite us being so remote and distributed, I've actually felt a lot more connected with my teams, right? Because like, when are you learning about their pets and dogs and kids and like, you know,
It's true. That's why I love having the background, the Zoom backgrounds off, because I want to see where you live. I want to see your background, you know?
You're inviting me into your home.
Yeah.
Right?
And some people want barriers, they want separation, but, you know,
I feel like that level of vulnerability really humanizes, right? Exactly. And being able to bring that as leaders into conversations. I think, you know, we at Stitch Fix, like we say a lot about like, how do you model the OS, right? OS is like how the Stitch Fix's culture, Stitch Fix's OS, right? And it really comes from how you model it yourself as a leader. If you're having a bad hair day and the kids are all over the place and it's a messy morning for you, just bring it. It's okay. You're human. You're not perfect. And totally. I felt like when you do that, your team really responds in a very positive manner.
Totally. Yeah. And also like trust, right? We were talking about trust earlier. Like when there's a lot of research about oxytocin, the trust chemical, and how it gets generated. And vulnerability is one of the main ways to generate it in somebody else, right? So when you're vulnerable, it actually creates that trust so that people are then willing to actually share how they're doing, even if they're not doing great, right?
You know, the thing that I started with my clearing, the concept of clearing comes from building trust. Right. Like show up vulnerable, people are just going to automatically trust you. And you're
totally.
Sorry about the chime.
It's all good. It's all good. No judgment. So getting back to the original question regarding the calendars, don't worry about it. No judgment. So you're managing your calendar. Obviously, people are getting overbooked, partially because they have to, like, again, simulate all of these water cooler conversations. It gets overwhelming. Really, really great tip to just book out your calendar, right? Book for lunch, book for the walk that you need. Like, part of self-care is booking yourself and saying, this is for me, and that you have to do that to be able to claim your space, right? So that's definitely a healthy one. I'm going to dive into a little bit of a lightning round in the last, 15, 20 minutes that we have just with questions. So we're going to I'm just going to kind of give you a question and you'll kind of do your best effort at like a 30 seconds-ish kind of response. And, it's okay to say, I don't know, I can't answer that in such a short time. Totally cool. No judgment. So how do you drive employee engagement, foster community, and also do team fun events? This is basically impossible to do in 30, but do your best. If you have any ideas, experiences to share, kind of, top ones.
Employee engagement, there's always the traditional ways of surveys and things like that, right? But I still, I feel like doing pulse surveys quick and often, and getting, and just sort of making sure that you're reading and also communicating what you're hearing is important. So I think, I feel like when people know that you're working on something, and even if it's challenging and hard, but being able to share that is a great way to keep your employees engaged. Right? Don't assume that you have to solve all the problems yourself, right? Sure. Be vulnerable, share the things that you're trying to figure out. But that's just sort of like my first thing that comes to my mind. As far as I think there was something around employee, like fun events, things like that.
Yeah.
And assuming the context still being while we're all working distributed, I think happy hours, virtual happy hours is always a great one. I do think co-working spaces are actually another way, right? Is like people don't have to have a beverage with you. You can just work together, and that's okay too. Have you seen like coffee chit chats, just sort of like different ways for people to just come in as a group and share things. I've also seen recipes being shared around, people cooking together.
Nice.
There's just, you'll come up with ways. But
it sounds like it almost doesn't matter necessarily what specific the thing is, right? It's like, be as creative as you want. What matters is people get together.
But I would say is keeping things optional is right. Not everything fits all. Right. So figure out that balance. And I feel like there's some that are required events, but a lot of these fun events, keep them optional so people can pop in and out.
Totally makes sense. Switching gears, have you changed the frequency or the length of your check-ins with direct reports in a remote working environment?
So I've gone back and forth on that, quite honestly, right? And where I landed was that I have changed the frequency. So instead of like a weekly, actually have it bi-weekly, because I think not just for me, for them too, to be able to not, have some space to do their things, right? So I feel like just opening up calendars on both ends has been helpful. But then I've also created more opportunities for these co-working spaces / study halls, right? Where I feel people still have been, my teams have been logging in because of the need to stay connected, right? So I would say is like, make those optional, but I have, actually one thing I wanted to share is that I've been making changes on my calendar that hopefully might actually be permanent changes too. You'll realize like when you really look through your calendar and you're selfish with your time and it's around self-care and other things, things also change. And I feel like maybe these things might just go away and I don't have to have bi-weekly check-ins with everybody in the world, or, just sort of, but that was advice my manager gave me. She was like, don't look at it from a pandemic perspective. Look at it as like, these might be permanent changes that actually might give you more focused time.
Totally. And if you see something that works for you better now that you think can last the pandemic, why not keep it, right? It's interesting. Yeah. It's interesting to hear, like my default kind of assumption would be that you would like increase frequency when we're talking about, again, that you have to sort of, overcompensate for the lack of water cooler chat. But it totally also makes sense that for some people, you might do the opposite if they may be super overwhelmed with their family there or whatever. Like, so the point is that there isn't a like one size fits all. It has to be case by case. You have to know your team, know what your individual team members need during a time like this, and that's going to be different from when folks are together. So that's a fascinating one. This is a kind of similar vein of measurements we were talking about earlier. How do you measure engineering productivity in a remote working environment in a normal timeline, not COVID? Also, have expectations of your engineers for velocity, productivity changed during this crazy timeline? I think we covered some of this, but I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add.
No, I really feel that, impact, like you have to think about impact versus just sort of number of JIRA tickets, lines of code. Like those are very old school ways.
Totally.
Like, I really like the OKR framework. I think OKR framework can be individualized from a team to an individual perspective, right? So
individuals make their own OKRs for themselves based off the team goals.
You commit to, and you talk to your manager about that, and it just sort of that aligns with what the company wants, the team wants, the product wants, and I feel like that's a conversation that you have to have. I've never felt like some of these sort of these numbers around tickets and they've never worked. Like people keep coming up with ways. I think they're interesting signals that are worth considering, but you really have to think about what impact you're driving and how can you measure it. And if you can do that on a team and a personal level, I don't think you need to have a different conversation.
That's great. And knowing that, you have those objective metrics, if you will, but the reality is when you're measuring people's productivity, even objective metrics are subjective, right? Like when you're looking at velocity, right? Like how many points is this ticket? Like, well, it's a little bit subjective too. And like, even if you do party planning, poker, or whatever, like there's still subjectivity in that. So having an explicit conversation about impact, which can be done through like an OKRs framework, like you described, is a much more straightforward way at getting at the heart of like, is this person having the impact that you want, which is cool.
What I like about that is also like you want your teams to be driving agency themselves through it.
Totally.
And when you're trying to define impact yourself, you're involved in that discussion.
Yeah.
Right? Versus you're bringing proof to look how much work I did.
Yeah, of course. That makes sense. All right. What are the most important characteristics? This is interesting. This is related to the career ladders thing a little bit, again, in job descriptions. What are the most important characteristics to have as a VP of engineering? Is the skill set highly technical or more on the managerial side?
So, VP of engineering at a technology company means you have to be technical. I've been a software engineer most of my career. I grew up through that ladder. And I realized, I know this is somewhat cliche, but it's worth saying, is what I really liked was connecting the dots. Right? I wanted to connect dots. I like seeing big picture. I'd like to get people focused towards missions and sort of move out of their way. Very cliche things that every leader probably says, right? But I think I really don't think that you can be a VP engineering without being technical. I also don't think that you can be responsible for a large organization without having an understanding of people, humans, organization designs, how to lead teams, how to get them excited, motivated, and move out of their way. So I think the balance, if I look at my calendar or my calendar over the week, I think I'm constantly balancing those two. I will tell you is when one becomes more obvious than the other, it's really important to rebalance because they're as important as each other. If I see myself just doing nothing but people management through a week and one-on-ones, I feel like I'm doing a lack of service to the business. There are technical imperatives that probably need attention. There's product technical enablement that I'm not doing enough balance with that.
It makes sense. And when you think about you talk about these two tracks, right? And that, these days, most modern tech companies, it's equally respectable. And you can even get the same level of pay doing the individual contributor path versus the manager path. But one of the key differences with those two paths is that with the individual contributor path, you don't need to do the people management. You don't need to develop that set of skills. With the management track, you still have all of that same technical stuff that's required of you because you're managing folks who are making technical decisions, and you're probably participating in those technical conversations as well, at least partially, if not sometimes, significantly. And you have to do the people management side. So of course that piece matters.
I think just one more thing there is I feel like you should be able to ask the right questions. It is and that's where I feel like people, I don't need to know all the details around, whatever new framework that you want to bring in, right? But you should be able to ask the right questions to help empower them to make the right choices. And I feel for that, you need to stay technical.
Sure. No, it makes total sense. So another question here, as a leader of a sizable body of employees, how did you communicate changing expectations, adjustments, et cetera, to the entire team? And how do you provide clarity to the team? So I guess this relates to lots of changes occur, I'm sure, right? Whether you're dealing with reorgs or, layoffs are happening right now for some folks, right? Any kind of challenging conversations, how do you approach communicating with your team?
So, I would say is there are two ways I would answer that question. One is, there's some things that if they're half-baked, sharing them early doesn't help. It causes more confusion.
Totally. When people announce, I go like this. There are some folks that I know personally who've announced layoffs before doing the layoffs. Yeah. And it's how can you erode psychological safety any more effectively than to make everybody question if their job's on the line, right?
Don't forget, you are, right? It's when I heard that question, my first response was going to be transparency. But actually, don't forget, you are in a leadership position.
Yeah.
Right. So the team is expecting answers from you. Right. Now, don't go to the point of unless everything is perfect, you won't share, because I think you want to bring people along, right? And you don't want to surprise, but don't share when things are half-baked. You're thinking of moving things around, and sharing that with your team is just going to create more confusion and a lack of trust that their decisions or things that impact them is in the right hands. Right. So once you've sort of gone through that escape velocity and you're actually you're going to do this, or you have enough information that, yes, this is the right decision, right? Then I would say is that transparency and over communication. my modus is to share it with the team first at large, right? Follow up with documentation with the next level of detail. So you basically like provide the voiceover in a real-time way, provide access to the next level of details, because it kind of depends on who wants what level. Some people want to know every detail in the reorg. Some people want to know why did you, what was the problems you were solving, right? So start there, give the details, and then provide a back channel or a direct channel, not back channel, direct channel to address questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's been sort of my note, but I would say you can't avoid any of those three when you're communicating large changes. You need to make room for all those three things.
Sure, it makes sense. It's really a good thing to call out, because I mean, we talk a lot about, again, like you need to be vulnerable as a leader to be able to create connection with your team and trust with your team. So you need to be transparent with your team so that you can create an environment of psychological safety, which, you know, Google has all this research talking about how it's the #1 indicator of team success. Like, you need to be able to have open, honest conversations. And at the same time, there's a set of conversations that you should not have if they're half-baked, that you need to refine, that you need to make sure that the messaging is agreed upon, et cetera, before you communicate in detail. And knowing the difference is an important.
You know, we practice this thing called like a comms plan. And I used to think it's like, oh God, like everything doesn't need a comms plan. But
Right.
something actually it does, right? It's like a leader in your team leaves. You need a communication plan. Now, understand that things are going to swirl quickly. People are going to talk about it. So the timeline might be really shifted, but you need to make sure that you know who you're going to communicate to and what the next step is from here, because your team is expecting that.
Totally. When they talk about like the 101 for PR and, like, you know, handling like TV interviews and stuff like that, they talk about how the whole idea of having a message and communicating that message multiple times is that if you don't have a message about a story, then whatever message that takes on a life of its own is the message. So you have to,
yeah. If you don't have a plan, you're going to be a part of somebody else's plan.
exactly right. No, it totally makes sense. So we have just about 3 more minutes. So again, kind of lightning round. What's your typical day look like while working remotely?
It's my typical day. Well, you know, as I said, I have 2 kids and a husband that also works full time. So we, you know, a typical day for me is, so I like working at 5 o'clock in the morning. That's when I do my best thinking. So just sort of, I get a couple of hours in the morning before the house wakes up. I manage to then switch to being a mom and making sure that the rest of the house has a routine, which means breakfast, get the kids changed, get sort of life back to, yes, we're going to homeschool, but that still means you need to get out of your bed and get some, you know, act like you're going to go to school. Post that, I would say morning is work and meetings and just sort of like what, you know, from 9 to 12-ish. That's somewhere what my day is scheduled for. Somewhere in the meetings there, I managed to prep lunch while not being on video, only on headphones, and get the kids situated. I try to take 12 to 1 as an actual lunch break, so I can give my husband some relief and then just sort of focus on the kids. Post that, schedule day 1 to 5, and then at 5 o'clock, just sort of, I take the kids out for a walk, call it the social distancing walk with the kids. Normal evening, I feel now, if anything, I really disconnect from at least 5 to 9 or 5, you know, just sort of make sure that you're present with your kids, your family, and then an hour of email at night before the next day starts.
There you go. Makes sense.
A lot of people's days look like that right now.
Yeah, it doesn't sound too unlike mine. I mean, and you know, it's certainly good when you're at home and you have work and life in the same place, right? That it's okay to create boundaries however you want.
Yeah, work-life integration.
Totally, yeah. Work-life integration being like the new work-life balance, right? A couple more questions. Maybe this was a quick one. You mentioned this like 6 week of trust concept. Somebody wanted to know where that was from. If you know where it was from,
Yeah, I don't have it. I'll put it in the notes.
That's fine. We'll follow up later.
Somebody, yeah, it's borrowed. It's a borrowed concept.
Borrowed, yeah, that's all good. And then last one, how do you manage wartime pressure for results with seeing stock prices falling, possible layoffs, versus productivity losses due to the lockdown, COVID, and all the anxiety from these times?
It's a loaded question.
Yeah, in 1 minute.
I mean, I'm assuming the essence of the question is that people, if you look at the economy, if you look at falling stock prices, things like that, like there's expectation of results,
yeah,
right? And then there's the reality of COVID and coexisting with COVID and what, loss of productivity. And I'd say, this is our jobs as leaders, is to keep balancing that. It's like, I'll give you my personal example. To some extent, keeping yourself focused and accelerating on initiatives at work has been my escapism, right? Sort of like, this is something I have somewhat control, agency over.
Yeah.
I feel I can do something.
Meaning and purpose, totally.
Meaning and purpose, and I feel like, yes, I'm doing rewarding work.
Yeah.
On the other end, there are days when I'm like, man, like the amount of just housework if you physically are constrained, right?
Yeah.
You have kids running around, you got to do cleanup, you got to, put dinner on the table, all of that. You just don't have enough hours in the day.
Yeah.
And just giving yourself that break and slack of, hey, I can't achieve everything, right?
Yeah.
I understand that there's aggressive or ambitious expectations, but I have to balance it with the reality.
There you go. That brings it all back to self-care, which is where we started the conversation, right? And keeping that in mind in this time. So I want to thank you so much, Pooja. It was great chatting with you and hearing your perspective and your wisdom. Great. And so with that, I'll hand it back off to Mustafa.
Yeah, thanks again, David and Pooja, for making time to share your wisdom. And also want to thank our participants or our attendees. And also one last thing, if you want to have a one-on-one mentorship call with either Pooja or David, I will send you those details. We'll send you a recap email. Plus, we'll also include the video recording of this if you want to share this with your team. So everyone stay safe, wash your hands, and we'll see you next time.
Awesome. Thank you. Great chatting with you, Pooja. Have a good one, everyone.
Everyone, bye-bye.
Bye.